Welcome to Mild History. Tonight we begin a journey not into history's grand halls or sprawling battlefields, but into the deep, cold quiet of a medieval prison, specifically focusing on the long hours after the last torch is doused, the true, desolate heart of the medieval night. We are leaving the world of open fires and the sound of life and descending into a space defined by stone, cold, and calculated neglect. This is a study in calculated sensory deprivation, a methodical examination of the specific environment engineered not merely to contain, but to slowly, methodically diminish the human spirit. Our journey begins not with the slam of a final door, but with the slow, physical act of descent. The medieval prison was rarely a purpose-built structure focused on modern concepts of long-term incarceration or reform. More often, it was an afterthought, a repurposed cellar, a subterranean storage vault, or, in the case of a castle, a space adapted from an abandoned oubliette or a foundational space never intended for habitation. This architectural reality immediately sets the tone. The space was not designed for human comfort, only for human containment, utilizing the pre-existing, non-negotiable chill and damp of the earth. Imagine the transfer. You are marched across a stone courtyard, the sound of your escort's boots muffled by the distance, the exterior air still carrying the scent of wood smoke and recent rain. The transition point is often a small, heavy door made of thick, iron-bound oak. This door does not whisper closed. It closes with a profound, metallic, echoing thud that absorbs the last ambient sound of the outside world, replacing it with a newly enclosed resonance. You are now in the transition corridor. This space is narrow, deliberately so. The air changes instantly. Outside, the air was cold. Here, it is damp cold, a specific, invasive chill that feels older than the stone itself, instantly seeking out and clinging to any exposed skin. The temperature is not simply low, it is geothermal, maintained by the constant massive heat sink of the surrounding earth, never varying, always below the comfort threshold. Your breath, which moments ago was simply air, now fogs visibly, a transient, ephemeral cloud that offers a brief visual confirmation of the heat you are losing to the environment. The steps begin. They are usually stone, worn smooth by centuries of miserable, shackled feet. They are often uneven, sometimes sloped deliberately to prevent prisoners from moving with any speed or confidence. The descent is rarely straight. It is a spiral or a zigzag designed to maximize disorientation. With every rotation, the last trace of natural light filtering from the surface is lost, and your world begins to shrink to the small, flickering circumference provided by a single, inadequate torch or lantern carried by the guard. Observe the walls. They are not dry. They are slick, covered in a thin, persistent film of dampness and moss. The stone is perpetually weeping, leaching moisture from the surrounding earth, meaning the air is highly saturated. This humidity is key to the overall feeling of oppression. It drastically increases the thermal conductivity of the air, meaning the cold penetrates clothing and layers of fat far more efficiently than dry air ever could.
The cold is not simply around you, it is chemically bonding with your skin. As you move deeper, the primary sensory input shifts from sight to smell. The air becomes thick, heavy, and layered with various distinct odors, none of them comforting. The first layer is the scent of mildew and mineral damp, the smell of stone perpetually wet. Beneath this is a profound, lingering, metallic tang, the smell of old iron from bars and shackles, often mingled with the faint, dried scent of old, shed blood. But the most invasive layer, the one that defines the space, is the pervasive, inescapable odor of uncollected human waste and rotting food. Ventilation is non-existent, leaving these stagnant, layered smells to become a permanent, nauseating feature of the low air pressure. The final element of the descent is the shift in acoustics. The thick stone walls and curved ceilings of the vaulting act as an acoustic laboratory. Sounds do not dissipate quickly. They echo, distort, and linger, often creating a sense of auditory misdirection. A cough from one corridor sounds like a whisper from the ceiling. A distant clang of iron sounds amplified, metallic, and final. As the guard's footsteps recede to deliver you to your final cell, the echoes of those steps bounce and confuse, leaving you unable to judge the distance or direction of your last human contact. This disorientation is not accidental. It contributes directly to the psychological erosion of the prisoner. The process of the descent, then, is a deliberate, phased surrender of control. You surrender warmth to the damp stone. You surrender vision to the increasing darkness. You surrender comfort to the noxious air. And finally, you surrender your accurate perception of space and time to the distorting acoustics. By the time you reach the lowest point, the cell itself, the physical and psychological groundwork for your confinement has been meticulously laid, utilizing the passive, persistent forces of the earth itself.
Having completed the slow, disorienting descent into the medieval prison's depths, we now arrive at the final destination, the cell itself. This space was not designed for rehabilitation or even long-term comfort. It was a purely functional container, an architectural manifestation of calculated containment and neglect, utilizing the most basic, unyielding elements of the earth to ensure the prisoner's submission. To fully understand the winter night, we must first analyze the dimensions and the materials of this solitary confinement. The typical medieval cell was astonishingly small, often described in period texts as being no larger than a stable stall or a small storage closet. Imagine a space perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, just large enough for a person to lie down, but never large enough to move freely or find a corner exempt from the damp or the cold. The small dimensions were deliberate, maximizing the sense of enclosure and physical constriction, forcing the body into an immediate, uncomfortable relationship with the unyielding boundaries of the stone. The primary material was invariably stone, often rough-hewn granite or limestone, dense and inherently cold. Stone is an excellent thermal conductor. This is a critical factor in the prisoner's experience of the cold. The massive thermal mass of the surrounding earth and rock maintained a constant, low, stable temperature.
and the cell walls were perpetually at this low temperature. When the human body, radiating heat at approximately 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, came into contact or proximity to this cold stone, the stone immediately began to draw that heat away with brutal efficiency. There was no escaping this transfer of thermal energy. The walls were simply waiting to absorb every calorie the body expended to maintain its core temperature. Consider the floor. It was rarely paved with smooth, comfortable material. Instead, it was often the bare, rough earthen floor of the excavation itself, or it was paved with uneven, hard-packed stone flags. This floor was consistently damp, cold, and often sloped subtly, contributing further to the disquiet and disorientation we noted during the descent. Any attempt to lie down and rest brought the body into direct, prolonged contact with this cold, hard surface, maximizing the speed of heat loss through conduction. To mitigate this, some prisoners, particularly those of higher status or those whose families could afford a small bribe, were provided with bedding, which usually consisted of a meager pile of straw. This straw was a temporary, almost cruel form of comfort. It was rarely clean, it was damp, moldy, and often infested with vermin and insects. It offered a thin, momentary illusion of insulation, but the dampness soon permeated the straw, and its insulating quality rapidly diminished. The straw then became a wet, moldering mattress that harbored filth rather than a source of genuine warmth. The most defining feature of the cell, however, was the ubiquitous moisture clinging to the walls. The stone was perpetually weeping, leaching moisture from the surrounding earth due to poor drainage and the immense hydrostatic pressure. This resulted in air with extremely high humidity. As we noted earlier, high humidity in cold air is devastating to human comfort. The water vapor in the air efficiently transmits the cold, penetrating layers of cloth and inhibiting the body's natural ability to create an insulating layer of warm air near the skin. The cold you felt was not just the low temperature, it was the aggressive, damp cold, a sensation that bypasses the skin and creates a dull, pervasive ache deep in the bone. Observe the lack of ventilation and light. The door, often the only opening, was heavy, iron-bound, and designed to shut with absolute finality. It contained a small peephole or spy hole for the guard, and perhaps a small, low opening, the Judas hole, through which food or water was shoved. There was no window. The air was completely stagnant, allowing the layered odors, human waste, mildew, rot, and stale breath to build up without dispersion. The air was not merely unpleasant, it was thick, heavy, and nutritionally poor, compounding the sense of oppression. The darkness was total, a profound and unchanging sensory feature of the night. Once the guard's lantern receded down the corridor and the door clicked shut, the cell was plunged into an unyielding blackness. The eyes, strained by the occasional torchlight, now received no visual input whatsoever. This forced the prisoner into a hyper-reliance on the distorted sounds and suffocating smells, initiating the psychological disassociation that defined long-term imprisonment. Time became meaningless, a constant, dark uniformity. Finally, we must note the absolute absence of amenities. There was no sanitation. The prisoner relied on a simple bucket or a hole in the floor that led to a septic pit, if they were lucky, or simply discharged into the nearest cellar. There was no furniture, no bench, no bed, no table, no shelf, nothing to separate the body from the cold, damp materials of the earth. There was no heat source. The faint warmth of the distant corridor torches never penetrated the thick stone, leaving the prisoner solely reliant on their own rapidly depleting body heat. This cell, then, was a masterpiece of passive torture, a space where every architectural choice, from the density of the stone to the lack of drainage, worked silently, relentlessly against the physical and psychological well-being of the confined individual, achieving the slow, continuous drain of vitality that ensured submission.
With the final click of the heavy iron lock and the inevitable fading of the last torchlight, the world of the medieval cell is reduced to a profoundly simple yet profoundly oppressive environment. In the absence of visual stimulus, the remaining senses, touch, smell, and hearing, are thrown into sharp, unwelcome relief. These three forces now begin their continuous, non-stop assault, working in silent concert to deplete the prisoner's physical and mental reserves throughout the endless hours of the night. We begin with the most immediate, pervasive, and physically damaging of these forces, the cold. The cold of the medieval prison was not a variable element. It was a constant, unchanging, geological reality. Surrounded by tons of dense stone and earth, the cell maintained a temperature that was perpetually stable, rarely fluctuating more than a few degrees and always lingering just above or below freezing point, regardless of the relative mildness of the outside air. It was a cold defined by its monotony. It never offered a moment of respite, never warmed slightly near a corner or during a certain hour. It was simply there, an enduring, static wall of low thermal energy. The quality of this cold, as we noted, was intensified by the ubiquitous moisture clinging to the air and the walls. This moisture acts as an efficient conductor of thermal energy. When you attempt to warm the air immediately surrounding your body, that heat is immediately drawn away by the dampness and transferred efficiently into the waiting stone. This effect means that the cold does not merely chill the skin, it saturates the core. Imagine the sensation. Your clothes, however thick they might be, feel perpetually damp, never truly dry, never truly insulating. The small pile of straw beneath you, if you have any, quickly becomes a wet compress that actively draws heat from your body rather than protecting it. The cold begins as a prickling sensation in the extremities, the fingers, the toes, before developing into a deeper, duller ache that settles deep within the joints and bones. This is the body's constant, desperate expenditure of energy, burning precious, rationed calories simply to maintain the temperature of its vital organs. You learn to recognize the specific ache of a body losing the thermal battle, the shivering that begins involuntarily, a futile attempt by the muscles to generate heat, the painful cramping in the calves and arms as the circulation slows, and the ultimate terrifying moment when the intense shivering ceases, replaced by a deep, numbing lethargy, a physiological signal that the body is dangerously close to surrender. The cold, continuous, and unchanging is the most effective long-term weapon in the architecture of suffering, silently draining life, hour after hour. Next, we address the sensory experience that defines the atmosphere, the smell. The medieval dungeon, lacking any functional ventilation, became a container for its own concentrated chemical history. The air was not merely stale, it was thick, heavy, and layered, a static accumulation of noxious gases and decaying matter that refused to dissipate. The air was a heavy, physical presence that clung to the back of the throat and contaminated every breath taken.
The first fundamental layer of this odor is the scent of the earth itself. Mildew, rot, and mineral dampness. This is the smell of matter decomposing slowly in a perpetually cold, wet environment. It is mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of fermentation, often resulting from spilled ale or the decay of meager rations. But the truly defining layer is the unavoidable, brutal scent of human contamination. Without sanitation, the air was saturated with the smell of uncollected human waste, mingling with the metallic, iron-rich scent of old blood and injury. The food that was provided, often stale or already turning, contributed the sickly sweet smell of vegetable rot and sour milk. These odors did not mix into a single generic unpleasantness. Rather, they stacked upon one another, creating a nauseating complexity that shifted slightly with every turn of the head. The psychological effect of this constant, noxious atmosphere was one of unrelenting nausea. It was impossible to eat without the smell contaminating the taste of the meager food. It was impossible to rest without the smell infiltrating every breath. The smell was a persistent, low-level reminder that the environment was not only hostile, but was actively toxic, preventing any moment of clean, clear respite and compounding the overall psychological erosion. Finally, we turn to the most disorienting of the three senses, the sound. The stone architecture of the dungeon, designed for structural stability, paradoxically created a perfect laboratory for acoustic distortion. Sounds did not travel in predictable straight lines. They echoed, bounced, and amplified off the curved ceilings and massive stone walls, confusing the sense of direction and distance. In the darkness, the prisoner's ears became desperately strained, yet unreliable. The soundscape of the night was dominated by two categories, the rhythmic and the erratic. The rhythmic sound was often the simplest and most maddening, the slow, repetitive drip of water onto stone. Drip, pause, drip, pause. This sound acted as a silent, morbid metronome, measuring out the endless slow hours of the night. It was a countdown of time that could not be stopped, a constant, low-level intrusion on any attempt at thought or sleep, reminding the prisoner that the environment was alive, leaking, and indifferent to their suffering. The erratic sounds were far more jarring and terrifying. These included the metallic clang of iron, a sudden, sharp noise of a guard shifting his weight, a chain scraping stone, or a distant cell door being unexpectedly opened. These sounds shattered the quiet, causing a powerful physical adrenaline response. Every metallic sound was a potential intrusion, a reminder that the environment was controlled by forces unseen and capable of unpredictable acts of violence or questioning. Interwoven with these were the subtle, pervasive sounds of human suffering from adjacent cells, the low, continuous moan of chronic pain, the sudden wet, hacking cough of consumption or sickness, or the quiet, desperate shuffling of a body attempting to find a position less painful than the last. These were the sounds of collective despair, a constant auditory confirmation that the suffering was shared, yet unescapable. Finally, at the lowest acoustic level, there was the dry, quick scratching and rustling of the vermin, the rats and mice, a constant low-grade anxiety trigger, confirming that the prisoner was sharing their small, confined space with predators of the darkness. These three sensory forces, the cold, the smell, and the sound, combined to create a continuous, non-stop physiological stress test. The cold drained the body's energy, the smell eroded the body's comfort, and the sound fractured the mind's ability to find peace, ensuring that the Viking night in the dungeon was a period of unrelenting, exhausting vigilance.
The Guardians and the System, the Night Watch. Within the fixed, unyielding environment of the stone dungeon, the only variable, the only source of potential change, terror, or momentary relief, was the presence of the guards, the human agents of the system. These individuals were not merely jailers, they were the gatekeepers of comfort and pain, embodying the entire capricious nature of medieval justice. Their routines, their temperaments, and their predictable corruptibility defined the prisoner's experience of the long night. The guards of the medieval prison were often low-status individuals, chosen not for their moral character or discipline, but for their brute loyalty to the local lord or their simple willingness to endure the noxious environment for a meager wage. Their relationship with the prisoners was defined by neglect and intermittent intrusion. For vast silent hours, the prisoner was forgotten, left to the mercy of the cold and the dark. But this neglect was punctuated by moments of intense, jarring, and terrifying contact. The routine of the night watch was sporadic, yet utterly predictable in its effect. At least once, sometimes twice during the long hours of darkness, the prisoner would hear the distinct, alarming sound of the watch approaching. This was an auditory sequence that triggered an immediate, powerful physiological response. First, the distant, uneven scraping of footsteps against the wet corridor floor, the sound carrying and distorting through the stone architecture. Second, the heavy, metallic, and profoundly resonant clanking of the massive key ring, a sound that signaled authority and the physical means to violate the security of the cell. The approach itself was terrifying because it was unpredictable in its purpose. Was the watch coming to deliver the meager nightly ration? Was it a routine check to ensure the prisoner was still contained and not yet dead? Or was it an unscheduled intrusion, signaling a late-night interrogation, a transfer to another worse location, or perhaps an unexpected visit from an official or a priest? The very possibility of the intrusion shattered any attempt at rest, forcing the prisoner into a state of unrelenting, hypervigilance until the sound finally receded. This momentary presence of the guard, illuminated by the flickering, greasy light of a lantern or torch, brought the only source of warmth and light the prisoner would see for hours, but this brief light was often crueler than comforting. It illuminated the dampness, the grime, and the despair of the cell, only to be cruelly withdrawn moments later, plunging the space back into a darkness that felt even heavier than before. This interaction was the primary point of articulation for the corrupt system of medieval custody, the bribe.
The medieval dungeon operated on a tiered system of comfort, dictated not by law but by money and influence.
The ability of a prisoner's family or friends to pay a guard a small illicit fee could dramatically alter the quality of their suffering. A modest bribe might secure an extra measure of ale or water, a slightly thicker pile of straw, which quickly became damp but offered momentary insulation, or, most crucially, a slight improvement in the quality of the rations. This bribery was an ingrained, expected part of the system, a private, untraceable tax levied by the guards on those still connected to the outside world. For those prisoners without wealth, without friends, or those long forgotten by the outside world, the bribery system became an instrument of deliberate neglect and active cruelty. Their meager rations would be the worst available, often stale, moldy, or deliberately substandard. Their water would be infrequent, and the guards' interaction would be limited to scorn, impatience, or active abuse, reinforcing the power imbalance with every interaction. The financial ability to pay for better food or slightly less suffering was the final pervasive reminder that status and money dictated survival, even in the presumed equality of a prison cell. The very act of delivering the ration was an exercise in power and humiliation. The meager food, often a chunk of stale, sour bread and a sip of water or thin ale, was rarely handed with care. It was often shoved through the Judas hole at the bottom of the door, landing with a wet thump in the moldy straw or on the damp earthen floor. This ensured the bread was contaminated, forcing the prisoner to eat food that had touched the filth of the cell. This method maximized the humiliation and minimized the interaction, treating the prisoner as an animal being fed through a slot. The night watch, therefore, was not a system of passive security, but a continuous mechanism of psychological pressure. The intermittent sound of the keys, the fear of the unexpected intrusion, and the necessity of constantly negotiating the petty corruption of the guards created a relentless emotional drain that compounded the physical toll of the cold. The guard was the physical embodiment of the prisoner's total loss of autonomy, a constant, unpredictable force that held the power over the most basic necessities of life, and thus over the very will to survive the long, cold hours of the medieval night.
The rations and the hunger, the daily bread. In the medieval prison, the allocation of food, the daily ration, was not a function of nutritional science or human decency, but a careful, calculating act of minimal subsistence. The jailers were obligated to provide just enough to prevent outright death from starvation, thereby avoiding the inconvenience of replacing a deceased prisoner. The reality was a meticulous, continuous process of caloric deprivation, a slow-motion famine that eroded the body and the mind over weeks and months. The centerpiece of the prisoner's diet, the ubiquitous symbol of their meager existence, was the bread. This was not the fresh, airy, well-baked loaf found in the town bakeries. It was a dense, heavy, often coarse loaf made from the cheapest available grains, usually barley or rye, sometimes mixed with even lower-grade materials like chaff or sawdust if the local economy was poor or the guards were particularly corrupt. The bread was typically delivered once a day in a single rough chunk designed to provide a calculated yet insufficient number of calories. Imagine the sensory experience of this bread. It was often stale from days of prior baking, with a crust that was hard, sometimes moldy from damp storage, and an interior that was either rock solid or alarmingly gummy and moist from the humidity of the cellar. The flavor was dominated by the sour, acidic tang of cheap grain and the faint, pervasive taste of mildew and earth imparted during its delivery, having been shoved through the Judas hole onto the damp, filthy floor. The prisoner's ritual around this single piece of bread was one of meticulous, painful rationing. It could not be consumed at once. A full day of activity, even the limited activity of a cell, had to be sustained by this solitary block of calories. The bread would be carefully, painstakingly divided, perhaps into 3 equal portions for the morning, afternoon, and evening, or sometimes into even smaller, more numerous fragments to stave off the persistent, crippling pangs of hunger. This act of rationing was an exhausting, continuous mental arithmetic, demanding total focus and discipline to delay the inevitable emptiness. Accompanying the bread, the prisoner received a liquid ration, usually water or thin ale. Water, if clean, was a genuine privilege. More often, the liquid ration was a thin, watery ale or small beer, delivered in a limited measure once per day. Like the table ale of the Vikings, this beer was low in alcohol, but carried the benefit of having been boiled during the brewing process, making it safer than unboiled surface water. However, the quantity was always meager, just enough to stave off critical dehydration, but never enough to truly quench the thirst or allow for any kind of washing. The psychological reality of this scarcity was the unrelenting low-grade hunger that became a permanent fixture of the prisoner's life. This was not the sharp hunger of a missed meal, but a chronic, consuming need that slowly and continuously drained the body's reserves. The physiological effects of this chronic deprivation were profound and methodical. The body first began to consume its fat reserves, followed quickly by the muscle tissue. The prisoner would experience dramatic weight loss, and their bodies would enter a state of continuous metabolic slowing, a desperate attempt to conserve the remaining energy by reducing core temperature and slowing heart rate. The physical consequence was continuous, profound lethargy, making even the smallest movements, sitting up, turning over, require immense effort. The nutritional poverty of the diet, lacking fresh fruits, vegetables, or consistent sources of animal protein, led to debilitating deficiency diseases. The absence of vitamin C, common in a diet of stale grain and water, meant that scurvy was a pervasive, terrifying threat, causing swelling of the gums, bleeding beneath the skin, and a crippling, profound weakness that could render the prisoner immobile. The lack of iron and B vitamins compounded the general anemia and malaise. Beyond the physical, the psychological impact of this controlled starvation was devastating. Chronic hunger attacks the cognitive functions, causing difficulties with concentration, memory, and emotional stability. The constant focus required for rationing and the continuous pain of the empty stomach dominated the prisoner's entire mental landscape, reducing their world to a primal focus on survival and food. Dreams became saturated with images of food. Waking thoughts revolved around the next small portion of stale bread. The daily ration, therefore, was not a gift of sustenance, but a carefully measured instrument of control and dehumanization. It was designed to maintain a state of physical and mental weakness, ensuring the prisoner was too lethargic, too hungry, and too focused on immediate survival to mount any form of physical or psychological resistance. The daily bread was a constant reminder that life was entirely dependent on the meager, contaminated offering provided by their captors, sustaining the body just enough to prolong the slow, cold agony of confinement.
The vermin and the filth, biological neighbors. Within the tightly confined, unsanitary walls of the medieval prison cell, the human prisoner was never truly alone.
The constant presence of vermin and biological filth was an intrinsic, unavoidable feature of the environment, transforming the cell into a shared, hostile ecosystem. These uninvited neighbors provided a continuous source of psychological distress, physical danger, and disease, reinforcing the prisoner's ultimate profound sense of degradation and neglect. The most imposing and psychologically damaging of these biological neighbors was the rat. The medieval dungeon, with its constant dampness, its lack of sanitation, and its consistent, if meager, supply of human food scraps, provided an ideal protected habitat for large populations of brown and black rats. These creatures were fearless, adapted to the dark, and entirely comfortable moving through the channels of waste and the crevices of the stone architecture. The presence of the rats was primarily an auditory phenomenon during the night. They were rarely seen in the absolute darkness, but they were almost always heard. The prisoner would be perpetually aware of their activity. The quick, dry scratching of their claws against the rough stone floor, the sudden, unnerving rustling through the damp straw, or the disconcerting sound of their teeth gnawing at a discarded bone or a piece of contaminated bread crust. These sounds, amplified and distorted by the cell's acoustics, shattered any attempt at peace, creating a constant low-grade anxiety trigger. The psychological impact of the rat was one of invasion. The prisoner, already confined to a minuscule space, had to acknowledge that their confinement was shared with a creature that moved freely, that carried disease, and that viewed the prisoner's scarce resources, and potentially the prisoner himself, as a source of food. A quick, sharp squeak near the foot, or the unsettling feeling of a brush of fur in the darkness was enough to trigger a powerful, physical reaction of terror, keeping the prisoner in a state of exhausting, continuous vigilance. Beyond the rats, the smaller, less dramatic but equally persistent forms of life were also present. Insects and parasites. The moldy, damp straw provided the perfect breeding ground for various fleas, lice, and body vermin. These parasites represented a continuous, relentless physical torment. Their bites and continuous crawling caused chronic itching and skin irritation, making it impossible to find a comfortable moment of rest or sleep. The constant need to scratch and shift was yet another factor that prevented the body from achieving the deep, restorative rest necessary to combat the cold and the hunger. The presence of lice and fleas was a direct, physical reminder of the filth and contamination of the environment, a persistent assault that the prisoner was utterly powerless to stop. The overarching theme of this biological environment was the filth and contamination itself. The lack of any sanitation meant that the cell was, quite literally, a waste-holding unit. The urine and excrement, often collected in an open bucket or pit, or simply allowed to seep into the earthen floor, provided the nutrients for the microbial life and the attraction for the vermin. This was compounded by the mold and fungi that thrived on the damp stone, releasing spores into the stagnant, unventilated air. The prisoner was forced to breathe an atmosphere saturated not only with human odors, but with the invisible, biological byproducts of decay. This biological reality had a profound, direct impact on the prisoner's health and longevity.
The rats, moving from the sewer pits to the cell floor, were vectors for devastating, fast-acting diseases. Fevers, rat bite fever, and the ever-present threat of the plague. The contaminated food, the filthy water, and the damp air provided the perfect conditions for the proliferation of tuberculosis, consumption, and various gastrointestinal illnesses. A simple cold or a common fever, which a healthy person could easily fight off, became a life-threatening crisis for a prisoner whose immune system was already ravaged by chronic hunger, lack of sleep, and constant cold. The presence of the vermin and the filth, therefore, was not merely an unpleasant feature, it was a calculated extension of the suffering. The constant awareness of the scuttling, the scratching, and the crawling created a state of unrelenting psychological terror, while the diseases they carried ensured that the struggle for survival was not just against the cold and the guards, but against a continuous, unseen biological war waged against the weakened body. The sounds of the rats and the feel of the insects were the constant, whispered confirmation that the human being had been reduced to an animal, confined to a pit where the lowliest forms of life thrived upon their misery.
The greatest damage inflicted by the medieval dungeon was often not physical, but cognitive. The environment was specifically engineered to induce a state of profound sensory and temporal deprivation, a condition that inexorably eroded the prisoner's connection to reality, memory, and the sense of individual self. The mind, starved of reliable external stimuli, began to turn inward, a process both protective and ultimately destructive. The first immediate assault on the mind was the disintegration of time. In the cell, there was no sun, no window, and often no sound other than the rhythmic drip of water. The prisoner was plunged into an unyielding, unchanging darkness. This lack of cyclical light, the daily visual cue of dawn and dusk, immediately dismantled the biological clock. Without the ability to distinguish day from night, the perception of time became fluid, distorted, and ultimately meaningless. Imagine the agonizing uncertainty. Has an hour passed, or have 6? Is the soft scraping sound the guard arriving with the morning ration, or is it a rat in the middle of the night? This temporal confusion was a deliberate feature of the environment. The jailers maintained an unpredictable schedule for the delivery of food, water, and even interrogation, preventing the prisoner from establishing any reliable routine. The mind, denied the structure of time, could only register the present moment as an endless, undifferentiated sequence of cold and darkness. Weeks could collapse into a single, amorphous unit of suffering, while minutes of intense fear could stretch into what felt like hours. This environment led directly to a profound attack on memory. Memory relies on anchors, specific events, emotions, and contexts. The extreme monotony and the sensory poverty of the cell actively worked to erase these anchors. Every day became functionally identical to the last. The same cold, the same smell of stale bread, the same quiet fear. Without variation, the brain struggles to encode new, distinct memories. As a result, the memories of the outside world, the faces of loved ones, the details of their former life, the specifics of the crime they were accused of, began to fade and blur. This process of amnesia was terrifying. The prisoner would spend long hours in a desperate, silent struggle to recall a precise detail. The color of a spouse's eyes, the precise scent of rain on summer earth, or the wording of the indictment. When these details refused to materialize clearly, the psychological impact was devastating. It suggested that the former self was slowly dissolving, leaving the current confined self as the only valid reality. The loss of memory was equivalent to the loss of identity, leaving a blank slate vulnerable to the narratives imposed by the system. The third pillar of the psychological toll was chronic fear and hypervigilance. The intermittent, unpredictable nature of the guards' intrusions, coupled with the auditory distortions of the dungeon, forced the prisoner into a state of continuous hyperarousal. Even in the deepest darkness, the mind could never truly rest. Every distant clank, every unexpected scraping sound, every subtle change in the air pressure was interpreted as a potential threat. This exhausting vigilance prevented the mind from achieving the necessary slow-wave sleep required for physical and psychological restoration. Sleep became light, fractured, and often filled with vivid, terrifying nightmares that compounded the waking fear. The continuous presence of stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, ravaged the body, leading to chronic anxiety, paranoia, and a profound inability to find inner peace. The mind was held hostage by the unpredictable threat of the unseen forces that controlled the light, the sound, and the meager bread. The psychological toll of the medieval dungeon was a slow, cold, continuous erasure. It was the gradual, inevitable breakdown of the structures of time, memory, and perception, leaving the prisoner isolated within a terrified, unreliable version of their own mind, utterly dependent on the external authority that controlled the light, the sound, and the meager bread.
The combination of the dungeon's hostile environment and the systematic deprivation we have detailed created a perfect lethal breeding ground for disease. For the medieval prisoner, the greatest threat was often not the hangman's noose or the interrogator's rack, but the slow, inevitable betrayal of their own body, weakened beyond the point of defense. Sickness in the cell was not an accident. It was an architectural inevitability, a natural conclusion to the prolonged exposure to cold, damp, filth, and hunger. The prisoner's immune system was under continuous, simultaneous attack from three major fronts: the cold, the filth, and the famine. The cold, continuous and pervasive, forced the body to divert massive amounts of energy toward thermoregulation, leaving fewer resources to fight off infection. The chronic exposure to the damp chill made respiratory illnesses, especially pneumonia and consumption, tuberculosis, endemic and rapidly fatal. The wet, unventilated air was thick with the microbial agents of disease, and the constant shivering and slow circulation made recovery a near impossibility. The sound of the chronic, wet, hacking cough was the true metronome of the dungeon night, a constant chilling indicator of impending mortality passing between the cells. The filth, particularly the constant presence of uncollected waste and vermin, introduced devastating contagions. The rats, moving freely between the open sewers and the sleeping area, were vectors for fevers and plague. Gastrointestinal diseases, dysentery, and severe diarrhea were rampant, caused by contaminated water, moldy bread, and the general contamination of the environment. These illnesses while often survivable for a healthy person, were catastrophic for the starving prisoner, leading to rapid dehydration and exhaustion of the body's already depleted energy reserves. The body, unable to retain the few calories it consumed, entered a lethal, fast-moving decline. The famine, or chronic nutritional poverty, caused the body to break down from within, leading to specific deficiency diseases that dismantled the connective tissue in the skeletal frame. The most feared of these was scurvy, caused by the total lack of fresh vitamin C in a diet consisting only of stale grain and water. The effects were slow, painful, and terrifyingly visible. Swollen, bleeding gums, the loosening of teeth, a profound lethargy, and a characteristic bruising or bleeding beneath the skin as the body's collagen structure dissolved. The victim became too weak to stand, often collapsing into a state of permanent, debilitating frailty. Similarly, the lack of vitamin D, due to the total absence of sunlight, led to bone degradation and severe pain in the joints. Crucially, there was the systemic and total absence of care. Medieval medicine, even outside the prison, was rudimentary. Inside the cell, however, it was non-existent. The guards were not trained in medicine. Their instruction was to contain, not to cure. A prisoner who became visibly ill was viewed not with compassion, but as an inconvenience or a liability. The sick received no special rations, no access to medicinal herbs, and certainly no clean bedding. The only form of treatment was often a passive separation, moving the sick person to a slightly more isolated cell to slow the spread of the contagion, though this was rarely effective in the shared stagnant air. This isolation was often a death sentence. Lying immobile on the cold, damp stone, the prisoner's sickness was compounded by the relentless chill. The illness itself became a final source of psychological terror. The fever brought delirium, shattering the last remaining clarity of the mind. The pain became constant, making rest impossible. The body, unable to sweat effectively due to the cold and dehydration, struggled to break the fever, ensuring that the simplest infection became a matter of life and death. The mortality rate in medieval prisons was therefore not a tragic side effect, but a functional component of the system. Death was the simple, cheap method of clearance. The bodies of the deceased were often left in the cell for a period of time before being unceremoniously dragged out, a silent, final warning to the remaining prisoners of the fate that awaited those whose bodies finally succumbed to the architecture of suffering. The final, chilling reality is that many of those who survived the cold and the hunger would eventually be defeated by the microbial environment. The dungeon was a space where the cold amplified the disease, and the disease magnified the cold, creating a closed, self-sustaining loop of physical degradation that ensured very few left the custody of the cell in a state of health, or often left at all.